Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, which this year we are calling Journalism at the Crossroads. Tonight our focus is American newspapers, headlines, bottom lines, and covering the war. I'm Marvin Kalb, Executive Director of the Washington office of the Shorenstein Center on Press and Politics at Harvard, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel discussion. I think it's fair to say that before September 11th, newspapers were already running into trouble. The economy was softening, ad revenues were falling, and newsprint costs were rising. After September 11th, things got dramatically worse, in large part because on top of the existing problems came the costs and responsibilities of covering a war like no other in American history. Fortunately, our panel is primed, quite expert in fact, to discuss all of these issues from different perspectives. To my left, Tom Wolzien, once my colleague at NBC News. Tom is the senior media analyst for a large research and investment firm called Sanford C. Bernstein and Company. It's a unit of Alliance Capital. That means that Wolzien analyzes such conglomerate giants as Viacom, Disney, AOL, Time Warner, Cox, Comcast, you name it, and then gives advice to large institutional investors. Sounds like a heck of a responsibility to me. To my right, Gilbert Cranberg, the George Gallup Professor Emeritus at the University of Iowa School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Cranberg was an editor at the Des Moines Register and Tribune for more than 30 years before teaching for 18 years. He is the author most recently of Taking Stock, Journalism and the Publicly Traded Newspaper Company. To my left, Geneva Overholzer, a journalist, editor, columnist, and now the Curtis B. Hurley Professor of Public Affairs Reporting at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. Ms. Overholzer was also ombudsman for the Washington Post after serving as editor of the Des Moines Register. In 1990, under her leadership, the Register won a Pulitzer Prize. To my right, Tom Curley, the president and publisher of USA Today, which now has a daily circulation of, hear this, 2,300,000, which means more people pick up and read USA Today than any other newspaper in the country. Curley has been a newspaper man since the age of 15, when he covered high school basketball for his hometown newspaper. He's risen, as you can see, rapidly since then. Finally, Robert Rosenthal, known as Rosie in the trade, who until last week was editor of one of the nation's top newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer. That is, until he was forced to leave his job after months of disagreement between him and his corporate boss, the Knight Ridder news chain. Rosenthal had been with the paper since 1979, working as a foreign correspondent, then an editor, and then the editor, and now the ex-editor. His story tells us much about the impact of economics on the newsroom. I want to talk first tonight about covering the war, then about the economic impact, and then about where we go from here. So let's start with the war. For many years, as we all know, newspapers, networks, all of journalism have been reducing the amount of space and time devoted to foreign coverage, cutting bureaus, cutting staffs. And then comes September 11th, and newspapers find themselves covering terrorism and a war in Afghanistan and a war tomorrow, God knows where. Does this mean that newspapers have broken out of their self-imposed isolationism and are now returning to real foreign news reporting?
Well, I think that it's too soon to tell, but there's no question in the last decade, really, there's been a retreat on some levels from consistent foreign news coverage in a lot of newspapers. The American public from the last decade really has grown less and less interested in terms of what's going on abroad and been really inwardly focused. And as a former foreign correspondent, I have a tremendous interest in it, and we've tried to sustain that. But there's no question that the cost of covering news from overseas for newspapers is a high cost. And it's also a matter of fending off and balancing out the local news coverage with the international news. And one of the things that I think happened is after September 11th, every story from overseas in lieu of and connected to what happened here really became a local story because it rippled out and touched all of us. So, you know, my hope is that the importance of knowing and having depth of experience in international news is going to be reinforced because it's not something you can just pick up on and follow up with. And again, in my experience, what's happened, and you can see it happening again, foreign news will ebb and flow, but when it becomes a major event, it suddenly becomes the all-encompassing thing that impacts the entire United States. So there has to be consistency.
Geneva, do you think that the newspapers, following up on what, do you mind if I call you Rosie? No.
No.
What do you believe that the newspapers, though, are returning to real coverage of foreign policy?
Well, what I believe is that the pattern change, Marvin, as you've mentioned, was so clear. There were, in 1970, newspapers used an average of 10% of their news hold, that portion of the newspaper that goes to news, on foreign news. And a couple of years before 9/11, it was down to 2%. So that's a dramatic change. And that change went along with a number of different currents, including a feeling, which I think all of us understand, that local news is the newspaper's franchise. The question is, in this difficult mix of what editors owe readers, one of the things is certainly, you know, what is it that you tell us you're most interested in? Another element is what is it we know we need to provide you so that you can behave as citizens in this democracy? And that decline has been stirring and dramatic. In terms of the cost of foreign news, of course, it applies to papers like the Inquirer, which have historically had their own reporters overseas. But in terms of the cost to a local newspaper, which the preponderance of the 1,500 daily newspapers in America don't have their own foreign reporters overseas, it really comes in terms of news hole and decisions how to use that precious resource. And I cannot imagine, although I love to be a hopeful person, that we are going to sustain the uptick in foreign news that we've seen since 9/11.
Tom Curley, do you accept the idea that first there was a definite drop in foreign reporting because, as Rosie was pointing out, the American people didn't have an interest in it? And do you believe there is a genuine return to the coverage of foreign policy?
Well, it depends a little bit on definition, Marvin. I think the issue is that the story changed from a Cold War story to a story of globalization and economics, travel, lifestyle, and sport. Many of those who had wedded themselves to the Cold War story found themselves pulling back. I think it was probably most dramatic at television networks and magazines. But some of us saw it as a story that Americans were involved more in the world and traveling more and participating in world affairs more. And so, for instance, we expanded our foreign coverage. And I think that to the extent people begin to see it as a financial story, as a lifestyle story, they will go back and they will stay with the dimensions of this story.
They will go back and stay with foreign coverage.
They will stay with foreign coverage.
Regardless of the cost.
Regardless of the cost. It's all about priorities.
Gil Cranberry, do you share that view? Priorities?
Yeah, the priority, until recently, until September 11th, the priority definitely had been away from foreign news coverage. We talked to a lot of stock analysts. We didn't happen to talk to you, Tom. We talked to a lot of stock analysts in connection with our study of publicly traded newspaper companies. And we summarized what they told us with this statement. Investment in the right areas is all important, and foreign bureaus are a wrong place to invest. Now that sentiment, expressed by people who have considerable influence with the newspaper community, that resonated in newspaper boardrooms and then, as a result, consequently, in newsrooms. And as several people have said, the result has been greatly downplayed foreign news. And foreign news coverage is expensive, but we have to bear in mind that these are not impoverished institutions we're talking about. These are highly profitable institutions. So it doesn't mean that they are going to go into the red by investing in foreign news coverage. It simply means that their profit margins are going to be reduced from astronomical to merely very good. and they can well afford foreign news coverage.
Tom, Dan Rather, when he was here for the last Kalb report, made a statement that journalism, not just newspapers, not just networks, but journalism was, quote, asleep at the wheel on September 11th, that journalism did not really prepare the American people for the dimensions of the shock that they experienced on that day. Money, we're told, has something to do with all of this. You study money, you study the networks, you study it all. What is your judgment on this? Was journalism asleep at the wheel?
Yes.
Absolutely. Why?
Question of relevance. If you don't have foreign bureaus, or you don't have your own people on the ground in places, you don't have a flow of information to come into the editors to say, hey, wait a minute, guys, there's something happening here you ought to pay attention to because it could affect the American people, and it's the responsibility of the networks or of the journalists to get that out. And in a way, then that is the flow of information that hits the stock market analysts. They don't have foreign bureaus. All they know is what they're reading in the press. So it's very much of a circular thing. As far as the finances are concerned, it's an issue of what public expectations are. If you think you can get 15% return on your money or 10% in return on your money, you're going to put it there as opposed to a place that you're going to get 1% return. And that's what happens with the money flowing into the mutual funds and the pension funds. Everybody in this room that owns stock, that owns mutual funds, is voting where those funds should be placing their money, whether they should be placing it in the news companies, whether they should be placing it in the oil companies or in some other place. And so, in a way, it's the expectations of everybody that are driving the financial
But Tom, I know that your responsibility is to look at the money, and I'm asking you that. But don't you guys ever talk about public interest? What is there for the public? What is it that the public should know about, should be concerned about, has a not a responsibility. The responsibility is on the side of the government as well as journalism. It's not just journalism. But what about public interest?
Sure. The Communications Act of 1934 was based on the concept of public interest, convenience, and necessity.
And when was the last time you guys looked at that?
I have. I doubt that there's anybody in this administration that has. And in fact, it is not in the corporate interests of companies to necessarily look at it that way when they're trying to get easing of government regulation so they can get yet bigger. On the other hand, they do use the public airwaves. Every newspaper company virtually has television operations. They do use the public airwaves. They are using something that's a product or that belongs to the public. And so that's something that was put in the Communications Act in '34 and probably is as valid today as it was then.
Tom, the government is blamed for a failure in intelligence. Everybody understands that. What about journalism? I mean, the government is filled with so many people and they all have mortgages and that sort of thing. But what about journalists and their responsibility? Do they feel a responsibility to inform the public? I guess the answer is yes. But why didn't they inform them about a threat as large as we now see and as omnipresent as global terrorism?
Well, I don't think anybody could envision what exactly happened, but let's back
Fair
up,
enough.
And I appreciate the question. People feel passionately that that's what you're supposed to do, is to inform them. On March 1st, we had a cover story on Osama bin Laden. In June, we in NBC News, Jim Michalczewski, reported that Osama was active. On the day after the 1993 World Trade Center terrorists were sentenced, we had a story saying more attacks were likely. In July, I was attending a luncheon with George Tenet, the CIA director. I asked for and got a private meeting ahead of time, and I wanted clarification on which newspaper was right. We were reporting these activities, and another was saying that Osama was overrated as a threat. He told me that Osama was indeed a threat and said that there would likely be multiple attacks before October, and he went on and discussed some other implications. Our reporter was out checking some aspects of that, was across the street from the pizza parlor that was blown up in Israel when that happened. There were a number of stories. Jack Kelly has been the lead reporter for us on this story. So there have been numerous efforts to report activities, and I think that there were at least 2 news organizations out there that were reporting many steps of this process. Now, if you look at today's paper, we report what happened during the Clinton administration in a retro back to 1993, and you can begin to see that some of the aspects of the investigation were unfolding. But this is a story that at least got some attention. none of us could ever envision what happened on September 11th.
Rosie, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was information out there, but I think if you think about what bin Laden did in the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Tanzania, these events and the pattern of terrorism, if you go back to '82 in Beirut, the Marine barracks and the embassy, they happened. But I really, I think that what's happened is because they were so far away and so distant, we grew to expect as a nation, it's an embassy, it's a military installation, the Kobar barracks. It was too distant. I think if you look back through the media, there were signals, there was information, this was happening. But as a nation, we just were so distant from it. And there was no, boogeyman. As Tom said, the fall of communism, there was always, as a foreign correspondent or a foreigner, there was a sense of good and evil, going on, and people paid attention to that dynamic. And really, in the last decade, the dynamic evaporated, and there was no, one thing to think about or one counterbalance to what we did. And again, I think that if you go back and look at these things, if you were paying attention, it was clear in bin Laden's own words that something might happen. I don't think the media. You could say we failed by not drumming it home, but it was also something that the public just really couldn't figure out or conceive.
That was going to be my question. Geneva,
we're soft pedaling the degree to which this really does reflect broadly. I mean, I understand, Tom, what you're saying. You certainly did terrific coverage. Certainly the Inquirer has done some. But the fact is, again, that the reduction in foreign news coverage has been dramatic and substantial, even more dramatic in newspapers in terms of its reduction than in television. And it does have to do, I think, with the fact that we have been an industry which has been pulling back in a number of ways, and that we've been an industry which has been increasingly concentrating on what we think people want, which is fine in many ways, but it isn't the whole responsibility of an editor. And there were actually fairly chillingly prescient reports which were poorly covered. I don't know about USA Today, but I know that the Hart-Rudman Commission produced a report in January which very precisely pegged some of these and asked substantially for the same Homeland Oversight Commission we have now, and the New York Times didn't even run a story on it. Now that's not a matter of retrenchment, because the Times has certainly been applying its resources, but it is a matter of our having become an industry that has lost its way in terms of understanding our commitment to expend the resources to give people what we know really is needed. And I do think fundamentally it is very much an economic question.
Rosie, what did the Inquirer do when the war broke out and the bombing began on October 9th, I believe? Did you all already have additional correspondents in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan?
Yeah, we moved people in coordination with Knight Ridder, throughout the theater. So we were in place and had people on this, as close as we could get. I mean, again, this is a war none of us have seen.
How many people are we talking about?
Including the people with Knight Ridder, they're probably 8 to 10 to 12 plus teams.
But Knight Ridder is the chain that would,
so
feed information to all.
We coordinated with them. In other words, we had to, we worked together with them. So some of our people would go over. We coordinate with them and the chain. So the Inquirer alone would have contributed people to investigative teams in Washington or around the country, as well as send people overseas and people we already had in place.
So how many additional people did you send somewhere, Washington or wherever, to cover the story?
Probably a total of, including going to New York, because it was a local story for us, probably, 25 to 30.
Additional people?
Yeah, people we diverted from other jobs in the newsroom have taken on new tasks, at least that many reporters plus editors.
What about USA Today?
September 11th.
Net on the specific period you're talking about was about 8. We also were shifting people from other departments. We had one very moving thing happen after several days of doing the obits or tributes, as we called them. Some of the people came in from sports and said, hey, let us do some of those. Our original team was getting pretty worn down by these stories. They're so gripping, and sports people said, we know how to do people stories. And that was a nice thing to see in a newsroom.
In terms of the coverage, do any of you sense already a kind of self-censorship that may be at work?
No, I don't see self-censorship. I think the fact is that in terms of what's happening on the ground, we really don't know anything. And, USA Today ran a story, I think the first one, or one of the first ones, saying that special ops forces were in Afghanistan. From the get-go, we have someone named Mark Bowden. I keep saying we. The Inquirer has
You get a certain number of weeks.
Used to.
Right. You know, so there are people who are have tremendous expertise on that, but I don't think there's a self-censorship. I think if I got a phone call or in my past job or the publisher got one from saying that troops were at risk, you really have to weigh that. But the reality is the American media, the world media, don't have a clue of what's really happening in Afghanistan, except from, you know, sat phone calls from Afghani commanders to journalists who are back in a safe spot. I know, and they face risk. I mean, there were 3 European journalists killed yesterday. Andy Maykuth, who works for the Inquirer and is part of that Knight Ridder team, I know today followed a tank in and going through minefields and had to follow the tank trail. You know, so the journalists out there, it's a real helter-skelter crazy situation, but the Pentagon has basically shut down the media.
Geneva, do you think that the Pentagon has shut down the media? Do you think that is even possible?
Well, I think it's very difficult to get any information, partly, of course, because of the dynamics between the press and the Defense Department, who have very different fundamental directions right now, but also partly because the nature of this war, which more even than the Gulf War, more than Vietnam, is an exceedingly difficult war in which to get information. But I agree with Rosie. I don't think it's that we're doing self-censorship, but I do worry that we may not be making as good a case as we ought to as a craft about why it is in the public's interest for us to get the information. And I think there are some among us who may be too worried about how we look and how the public views us and too ready to assure them, oh no, we're patriots as well, and not to remind the people that skepticism is patriotism for journalism.
I would go ahead, Bill, please.
Yeah, the kind of self-censorship I sense is in an unwillingness to take issue with the government. For example, in the President's speech to the joint session of Congress, he said, and he reiterated later, we are not going to negotiate. I am not aware of any editorial page or any columnist that even raised the question about a no negotiation policy, or even asked the question, well, what can we lose? You know, why close the door to negotiation? Similarly, when the Taliban said, show us the evidence, apparently we did not respond. And I believe we did have evidence. After all, bin Laden had been indicted for the bombing of the embassy, so we did have evidence against him. And if the Taliban did what we had demanded, that is, turn over bin Laden, then he would have been brought before in some kind of legal proceeding. We would have been obliged to show the evidence at that time. So why I don't understand the position that we took. After a while, Tony Blair released the evidence. So evidently our hands would not be sullied by responding to the Taliban's request. And again, the press simply accepted this, did not question it, did not criticize it. And that's the kind of self-censorship that I'm concerned about. The politicians are loath to be seen as critical. But the press is not running for office, and the press, if that institution is not going to speak out, then I think it's unfortunate.
I find myself very much on Gil's side. I think there has been already any number of illustrations of a kind of self-censorship at work, and I think it's understandable from what it is that Geneva was saying before about this overlay of patriotism, and it's very difficult to appear to be taking on the government.
Marvin, I wonder if it's self-censorship, or I wonder if it's just not very good reporting. If you look at the Seymour Hersh work in the New Yorker, which has been right at the government, questioning the night drop and so on.
Doesn't make it right.
Doesn't necessarily make it right, but that's the only place that I know of that anybody has really been doing source work. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know, but a decent track record there, that anybody's been doing source work that raises any questions or provides any counter view to what's coming out of the Pentagon. Is he the only person in the country that's wired like that? I don't know.
I don't know either, but I do have a feeling that I'm involved in a program now to try to facilitate a better exchange between the press and the Pentagon, and I have a sense that the Pentagon, to the degree that it can, is actually trying in its work with the Washington bureau chiefs to get a lot more information out. But they make it very clear that there are certain areas that they're not going to provide information on. Special operations, forget about. Let's move ahead, though, to the economics that I promised you we were going to get to.
Okay.
And let's talk about some of that economic impact. And the question I'd like to start with is, can newspapers afford to continue to cover the war pretty much at current level? Pretty much at current level. Rosie, what is your sense?
I think it's going to get a little tougher. I can tell you that in my former incarnation, between September 11th and when this all happened last week, I was not questioned about the expense. Newshole, newsprint, and we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. At the same time as revenue is just tanked completely. So, but I do think that there will come a time soon if this story will slow down. And then if you remember what's happened, I mean, you had all the information stories after September 11th and the aftermath, and then you had anthrax. But in terms of the actual what's happening on the ground again, whether we're doing a good job or a bad job, there's been so little information actually about the war. So there was a tremendous amount of newshole used stories in terms of anthrax. The military, it appears to be moving very quickly, more quickly than people thought. But I think there will be some questions asked and raised about expenses as the economic downturn continues and just how much we're going to have, information we're going to have. But I can tell you up until now, at least I think in Philadelphia and with Knight Ridder, even with all the issues I faced, that wasn't something. Other things may suffer, though. I mean, there's a balancing act here. And again, what the priority is, as Tom said, and what's the most relevant to readers is going to really drive that. And other parts of news coverage may diminish, I think.
Tom, the president has said that this war is going to go on for years. Now, is this kind of coverage going to be able to be sustained for years?
Well, this is already the biggest story any of us have had to come to grips with. And when you talk about the war, you have to talk about the home front and all the ramifications.
Yes.
And when you talk about getting information, you're talking about any number of agencies. And right now, after 7 or 9 weeks, a lot of our people are facing exhaustion. And so we're looking at trying to find other resources to bring in. So
you're talking about human resources?
Human resources. Okay. Just some people have been on the story every minute since September 11th and have not had time off and what have you. And you need to rotate people back and forth from the war zone. So you're looking at having to make some decisions about what gets staffed and what doesn't get staffed. But we also are blessed today that we have a large .com contingent, and USA Today also has a television wing. So we have lots of other journalists available, and we may have to make some shifts as to who works where and on what story.
Could you put a dollar sign on the amount of money that it has cost USA Today to cover the war, to cover this story since September 11th?
That's probably $1 million, just extra space and travel costs alone.
That sounds like very little to me. That would be all?
Television and newspapers are different, Marvin.
Different, I guess so. I guess so.
We don't go to the restaurants you guys go to, I guess.
Yeah.
Nor in any in Afghanistan.
Are the costs already becoming too much of a burden for the newspapers, in your judgment?
I think no, not at all. I think, first of all, the public is with you. This is a defining moment. And you have got to invest in content, and you've got to be credible, and you cannot make an error. So these principles have to guide us. Trust, accuracy, completeness are a part of any major newspaper's response at this moment. There can be no turning back from that.
This is an opportunity for newspapers. I mean, in the chaos and onslaught of information and news, especially in the first few weeks when this happened, it was, you're watching television, you get images and images and images, but the sound bites and the streaming lines on the bottom were just overwhelming for people. Newspapers, this is an opportunity to frame the issues, to touch people in their hearts and souls.
But you've already said it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Well, but you can look at it short term, but I think if people see the value in the newspaper and in the printed word, maybe you'll hold them when the story slows down.
Yeah, but you yourself had a realistic collision with Knight Ridder.
Well, it wasn't so much with Knight Ridder as my publisher, but
well,
whoever.
Was he working on his own?
Again, I'm speaking from what I believe in, and there are conflicts over this. And again, again, the debate I really faced was what the definition of local news and relevance was. And I personally believe very strongly this story, and as it continues, is relevant to all of us on every level. And it's how you make your selection and what you're going to do. It's not only the story from northern Afghanistan or about the Taliban. It's about running a page or 2 pages of kids' art from a 5th grade classroom. And it's because this touches us all where we live.
But Marvin, the truth is that everything Tom and Rosie have said is right. This is the moment when we must invest. This is when readers are hungry. We all know in our gut that this is what we need to do. But it will be a miracle if there isn't turning back, and soon, because these investments have been huge. And the average newspaper editor and publisher don't command the same resources that Tom Curley commands. And they're just not going to be able to sustain it unless there is a real change in the way newspaper company CEOs decide they're going to run the company. Because, as Gil said, you say that you use the word, can they afford it? Well, sure, they can afford it. Newspapers make 2 to 3 times the profit margin of the average American business. But they're under huge pressures to return those profits. And unless they change that story, they'll have to change. And they will pull back from it, and soon.
But it may be very difficult to measure because they can provide sustained coverage of the war. After all, you must do that. But what else will they sacrifice? You're going to have to look at newspapers very carefully to see if in exchange for that, they're cutting back, say, on news hole for national news or local news. So, and the short answer to your question, can they afford it? Sure they can afford it. There's absolutely no question they can afford it. The question is, will they be willing to make the expenditure?
Why should there be that question?
Because think of this industry, which is an industry there that I saw a list of salaries of 39 starting salaries that Michigan State University looked at. And newspaper starting salaries for reporters were 37th out of 39, just right above preschool. That's preschool teachers. That's been happening while our profits have been these high. We have practically no R&D. I mean, it just doesn't exist. We don't believe in the future. As somebody I heard said the other day, being a cash cow is a policy. And that has been the policy of American newspapers. So, and unless the conditions change, I mean, my friend Tom here will tell me why, of course, that's going to continue to be true. Those profits are going to be demanded. But we're not suddenly going to say, oh, it turns out that we need to give people foreign news. So by God, let's spend $1 million on that. Why didn't we think of that before?
Well, in answer to the question, for our book, which I might say is titled Taking Stock, Journalism and Publicly Traded Newspaper Company, Iowa State University Press. For that study, we interviewed a large number of people, and but we also studied proxy statements and really examined the inner workings of these papers, of these newspaper companies. And what we found in a nutshell is that the incentives that have been created for the newspaper executives, and I'm talking about the newspaper company executives, and now increasingly into the newsroom, the rewards are based on financial performance, not in every case, but in a large number of cases. And so built into the system is a fixation on stock price and return revenues, that type of thing. And that's why it's problematic that they will be willing to make a sustained commitment.
Let me ask Tom Wolzine a question here. We have, in doing the research for this program and other programs as well, we keep on hearing about Wall Street forcing the corporations to do certain things, that the street wants it that way. We've got to do this because of the street. And when Jay Harris resigned from the San Jose Mercury News, the issue came up again in the springtime of this year. And the idea was that if the corporation makes 22% And in order to sustain certain cuts, it may have to go down to 18%. No, we wanted it. Well, the street wants it that way. It's as if the publisher or the corporate head has no mind of his or her own. What's the reality?
I think I go back to where I started, which is the street reflects investments. Investments reflect where mutual and pension funds want to go. Whose money goes into mutual and pension funds? Everybody here. They decide where to put their money. They'll put their money where they think they're going to get a better return. So as long as the broad expectations of the society are for double-digit or types of returns, that will be reflected through the way money gets invested and then into the companies. Now, it's interesting that when you look at some of the more privately family-held companies, some of them, New York Times Company, for example, that companies seem to be more willing to invest on the news side and just sort of take the wrath of Wall Street for the time being and work their way through it over time. So I think that when you look for an enemy in this context, when you look at Wall Street, you have to look through Wall Street at every individual in the country who's allocating where they want to put their own money and what type of returns they want to.
So that the responsibility then is not really in the hands of the publisher or the corporate
Sure
head.
it is. Sure it is, because he can say, look, we've cut this to the bone. We can't cut it anymore. Deal with it, folks. And I think that's about where we're getting right now. We've been through a year of cuts. This isn't an issue of the costs of covering this horrific incident that's been going on here the last 2 months. This is really much more an issue that over the last 15 months, advertising across the whole country has reduced radically.
Right.
2000 was an all-time record for advertising, and we're coming down from it very substantially, and that drops straight to the bottom line. So in that context, we have right now these extra news costs. But you know, I don't know any company of the ones that I cover that are going to the news divisions and saying, shut it down. Nobody's saying that. The big conglomerates are going elsewhere in the company and saying, you guys have to cut. You got to cut in this entertainment area. You got to cut in that back office area. But the news people are not yet complaining and saying that they're under pressure. They almost have a blank check for the last 2 months.
Well, is it just the networks that are being cut then? I mean, ABC gets cut about $25 million a year for the last 4 or 5 million.
For the last year, but I'm saying right now over the last 2 months.
60 Minutes just now lost some people, right? I mean, these cuts are continuing in the media even now.
Well, I'll ask you the question. They're probably adding another issue of 48 hours. ABC has just added another hour. Anybody that in news that begrudges airtime or print space doesn't get it. The issue is how much distribution do you have? How much distribution can you take today? And then as the advertising market comes on, can you hold on to that? Because that's how you increase your overall revenues. Tom's shaking his head over there.
Tom,
yes.
Explain from your point of view. You're president and publisher, 2,300,000 copies a day go off. That sounds to me like an awful lot of money that you're making. How do you respond to that description by Woolsey?
Well, he's right on. I mean, the two facts of life are money goes where it's treated best, and you have to deal with it. And the biggest criticism I ever heard was when the stock price dropped and the reporters who had their money in the 401k were as cranky as anybody. So let's put everybody into this pool of critics. The second aspect that we're ignoring here is that it's not just about newsrooms operating in some terrarium out by themselves. They're part of an ecosystem, and what's changed, and the revolution has been on the distribution side. And if you look at network television, you have these massive staffs. Let's say they once were 1,000, they're now down to 800, and they may get down to 500 people to air 22 minutes a day. Meanwhile, there are these other models that have come up on cable where they get paid by subscribers. They get subscription revenue as well as advertising revenue, and they're on the air all the time so that they can, if you pardon the word, monetize their investments in the news content over a larger platform. On the magazine side, the distribution in the United States is consolidated. There are 4 primary distributors of magazines and periodicals in the United States now. That's a massive change. The publishers used to have a lot of power. Now the distributors have a lot more power. The publishers are getting squeezed, and so on. So these other changes are taking place, and we have to adjust to them.
You're not saying that Wall Street is forcing me to do this. You're saying that the issue is an infinitely more complex one.
It's more complex, but it comes back to competition. And it's competition in more forms. There has been a proliferation of voices. There has been a proliferation of investment in media, and there's more competition. It's not just the old three networks now. There are how many sources of instant news all the time, and so on in the magazine field, although they've started to consolidate it.
Rosie, from your own experience, recent painful experience, Gail Schister was quoted by the New York Times, a TV critic, Philadelphia Inquirer, described what happened when Rosie and the corporation parted, got divorced. It's like Dresden after the bombing, she was quoted as saying. Rosie represented in some ways what was great about the Inquirer because he's a total news guy. My question, does that mean that total news guys like you can't survive in today's newspaper world?
I think you can survive. I think that survivability is being in a place where, I mean, there's definitely a culture and a values clash that, from my perspective, was about short-term meeting a number, goals from Wall Street, or telling the analysts you're going to hit X, whatever the percent was in profit, as opposed to looking at the consequences of cuts in terms of content in a newspaper, and long-term building up credibility and value in your market. And I think the war or the crisis around terrorism, from my point of view, is an opportunity, as I said earlier, because if people come to the newspapers, and circulation has been up in a lot of places and it's staying up, you're changing a value system that may not have existed before in terms of foreign news improving value. But I think the conflict is definitely with what I was always told about what the analysts expected on Wall Street and what the stock price would do if, for example, from my point of view, you said, this is what we're doing this year. We're going to reduce our margin by 2%, but we're going to invest in this coverage, and in 3 years from now, we're going to show, or 2 years from now, our profit will be higher because we're going to build up readership, increase revenue and advertising based on the content and the credibility of what we have.
What profit margin did your boss, your corporate leadership?
I think Knight Ridder, you would probably know the numbers. I'm not a numbers person. It's part of my problems. I think Knight Ridder, I think Tony Ritter announced, I'm not sure, you may know the exact number, but I think he was talking...
was it 22%?
I don't know if it was 20 or 22%, you know, for Knight Ridder. I think in the industry average is higher than that, isn't it?
And was the idea, Rosie, that you felt that to achieve that kind of profit, you'd have to have certain cuts in staff and coverage?
Well, like most newspapers, yes. I mean, we faced a long-term, from my point of view, reduction in staff, in the people. I mean, the best companies are based on terrific people. Journalists are not movable parts. They operate on passion and creativity and are highly motivated people who didn't get into the business to make money, so there's a culture clash there. And yes, over a period of 15 months, there was a major reduction in staff. And how do you allocate resources in a paper like the Inquirer and keep a balance between the demands of the local reader and demands of foreign news and all the other things in a big metro market?
So it's been going on for 15 months. What is it, if you wish to share it with us? You don't have to. What is it that happened at that final moment where either you or they said, the hell with it, can't go on anymore?
I think it was it wasn't a moment. It wasn't that dramatic. It was a culmination of a lot of things and frustration from probably both sides. And it really, to me, came down to a clash in values, I guess. And, you know, I didn't really have a choice. And it was something I felt I couldn't sustain and do what I do best, which is react from my gut and follow my instincts. There was too much second guessing, and it gets to the point Geneva was making about values and following, you know, in terms of even foreign news or other things, what's important. And I think that is a crucial issue, not only for papers like the Inquirer, but probably for the American media, especially
Marvin,
print.
Tom, go ahead.
I don't know if it's coincidental or not, but I used 15 months, and you just used 15 months, that the advertising started to decline 15 months ago. Now, touch on this, the issue of Wall Street expectations. The way that works is that the company management will go out in the quarterly conference call and say, I think we're going to get 22% earnings growth next quarter. I think for this year we're going to get X amount. These are the CEOs and the chief financial officers of these companies. That's how Wall Street expectations come to pass.
Right, and Tony Ritter has been setting those expectations.
So those are not Wall Street expectations. Those are company expectations that are made with an attempt to cause Wall Street to have a certain view of the stock to buy the stock, to drive the price to a certain level.
But you're describing it as Wall Street reacting. Then.
Absolutely. I don't really care, and what I do, I don't care if Disney is saying, look, this current quarter is going to be down in operating income 50% or more from a year ago. What I will do is I will put that into my numbers and say, look, based on that and where I see Disney going over the next 12 months, here's what I think is a reasonable price for that stock, and it either is higher or lower than where we are.
Well, it always seems like there are more things that CEOs could be saying. Whenever I hear analysts like you, that they could go, Doug McCorkindale could go and say, I'm going to produce a steady return rather than, or you can bank on us to have higher circulation gains, or things that we haven't been saying.
But in an advertising climate like this, everybody's estimates are right out the window. So at some point you say,
that's why
look,
I think
guys,
it's a moment to change the tale.
Kremberg, in your research, do you believe that it demonstrates that Wall Street was reacting, as Wolzine says, or dictating?
Well, I think the newspaper companies, by and large, were willing partners. I mean, they were playing the game. The newspapers are a business, obviously. They have to make profits.
So they've always been a business.
Yes.
So what's new now?
No, there's nothing new now. My point is that newspapers are a business, but they are a different kind of business. They have constitutional protections, and everybody in this room knows other ways in which they are different. Society, a democratic society, needs the kind of information that newspapers provide in depth. So it's a different kind of business. The trouble is that when the companies went public, they decided knowingly that they wanted to be treated in the marketplace the same as any other business. Mm-hmm. And so they behave like any other business. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. These companies have to be reshaped. Look at the boards of directors on these companies. The absence of journalists on those boards of directors are palpable. They need to be reshaped. You look at who serves on the compensation committees, likewise. That has to be changed. And
who's on the boards now? Not journalists, who are they?
Corporate types.
Corporate types.
Yes.
Is
Lawyers
that right?
and CEOs of other companies.
Investment bankers.
Yes, right.
You mean like Wolzine?
Not an investment
Wolzine,
banker.
are you on any of these boards?
He's pure.
No, I'm not an investment banker. But that's a good point, that there's been so much consolidation of late that that companies, to consolidate, to push together, they've been paying high levels for the companies that they've been acquiring. And then to cover the interest on that, they have to deliver certain levels of return. So, Marvin, I've got this thing, and this is horrible to do this to the audience, but I'm going to hold this up and you can get an idea of the sense. This is America Online over here at about $150 billion in market cap. That's the number of shares out times the price that it was trading at last Thursday. Down over here is Knight Ridder at $4 billion in market cap. 150. Viacom, half the size of AOL. In this context, for these companies, what this is basically an invitation for, assuming government regulations allow, is for all of these smaller companies to want to find some sort of relationships, merge or push together, to be able to, in this environment, compete with these bigger guys out here. Because you know what? They're all going after the same pool of advertising, the same $230 billion of advertising. They're all going after the same capital resources.
Meaning
so
that
there's tremendous motivation to push these together.
If there are, I can't see how many, but let's say there are about 15 corporations there, that if you were to project 5 years into the future, there might be...
We'll be back to an oligopoly. It'll be back to an oligopoly. A handful of big guys.
So some people think we're going to have to find other ownership models when you look at this, like the St. Petersburg Times, which is owned by an academic institution, or look to healthcare to see what kinds of mix of private and public ownership. I mean, who knows?
But universities running a newspaper.
What I would like to see is that the journalistic profession, like organizations like American Society of Newspaper Editors, start paying attention to compensation committee reports and publicize those compensation committee reports to see what it is, how it is that the top managers are rewarded, what is being rewarded. And usually the reports will say compensation is being awarded on the basis of company performance. But then you read further. Company performance is not defined in terms of the quality of that company's newspapers. It is defined almost exclusively in terms of numbers, financial performance. That has to change.
Not even circulation.
Not even circulation.
Well, we've got less than 5 minutes to go before I want to turn it to the question and answer part of the evening. But we haven't talked enough about the internet. I know that Tom mentioned it just briefly when you talked about your .com operation. Are newspapers going to have to adjust more to the reality of the internet? Is it going to have to, will it be more dependent upon the internet? Is the internet or the .com operation still very much a crapshoot?
Well, a crapshoot in terms of making money or
Yes.
getting return? Yes, they're all sinkholes right now. There's no question about it. But yeah, I mean, the fact is that even in this year of contraction, to use the phrase of Major League Baseball, the internet traffic, I think, will double again. So this is real, and it's going at a faster rate. The whole telecosm, the telecommunications change is going faster than the whole computer revolution. So you have to play.
You have to play, but you're investing money in this game, and
Absolutely.
you're losing. But at what point, I mean, how many years out into the future are you going to go
Well, we
losing
actually
money?
made money for a couple of years, and obviously in this environment we've had a setback, and our goal is to get there soon in terms of making money again.
The internet, you know, our operation, the Inquirer's operation in Knight Ritter's, I think it's a tremendous opportunity because, again, if you believe in the credibility and the value of newspapers, they're going to be a place where people will go. And the model works very efficiently because the reporters we have know how to get the information, frame stories. It's not as if you have to bring in scores of other people. They're doing it automatically. And I can tell you, in Philadelphia, we take great pride in breaking stories on our website because we'll get them out there ahead of the news radio or the local cable, and for me, it's a natural fit, and it's a cycle of news gathering. It's just another way people are going to use our content. And I think the future of newspapers, again, the business model hasn't been developed, but at some point it will be. It's going to be crucial.
Is it going to have to reinvent itself? I mean, will the newspaper
No, I think there'll always
find
be
its
newspapers.
future on the internet?
No, I think the internet will be another way that the content that newspapers have always created gets to people, and there'll be newspapers, but fewer people, I think, will be reading them, but I think the traffic is going to continue to accelerate. And if you think about all the things in a newspaper and how you can aim those at specific groups of people who want that content, as well as the breaking news component, going back to the good old days, call rewrite. I mean, we have set up a rewrite bank in Philadelphia that reporters, you know, they call in. So I think the internet is an opportunity, again, for all the things we do well.
Geneva, would you recommend to young people that journalism is still a noble and magnificent craft, and this is the future, kid, and go into it?
I do it every day.
You do it every day?
I do.
And do you mean
Absolutely,
it every day?
I mean it, because I do think the future is rich. Information is gold. In any given city, the newspaper's newsroom has more of it than anybody else around. And to use Tom's phrase, brotherhood, sisterhood here, if we can monetize that, the sky's the limit.
Marvin, I have a different take on that.
Please.
Back when I started work at the Des Moines Register, the editor told me, don't expect to make much money because we are engaged in a public service, and you should think of yourself as you would think of a social worker, and you should judge your pay scale according to the way social workers are paid. And I accepted that because I concluded we were doing important work, public service work. Today, I'm not so sure. If I was working on a newspaper today, I'm not sure that there would be that trade-off of pay for a sense of public service, because my sense is that increasingly newspapers do not see themselves as having a public trust mission.
We have any number of people who are in a war zone, and one of them just missed getting shelled yesterday. So I think that that mission sense is very much...
I would agree. I think there's tremendous problems and issues, but I think the newsrooms that... that function well still understand that, and there's nothing as exciting to feel valued and serve the public, and I think newsrooms all around America felt that way after September 11th, and reinvigoration.
One of the questions that comes up, remember the Thomas Jefferson line about newspapers, you know, whether you could survive a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government. Decided that he'd rather have newspapers without the government. And I can't quite imagine myself a world without newspapers, and I don't even want to imagine such a world. I think that everyone, whether publisher or editor or scholar, journalist, Wall Street analyst, whatever, they all are now going to have to raise their sights to some higher national purpose, because these are tough times, and that only makes our common challenge all that much more compelling. I'm Marvin Kalb. I want to thank you all for being with us. Thank you and good night.